Have you ever been told that you had lazy glutes? Can you not feel your glute muscles when you're doing your compound exercises like squats, lunges, and deadlifts? If you don't really know if you have lazy glutes or not, don't worry, we're going to do a test together to find out. So you're going to lay on your back with back flat on the ground, hands by your side, and feet and knees shoulder width apart. And then you're just going to lift up your hips, come back down. You're going to do several reps. So did you feel your glute muscles when you're doing that move just now? If you feel like your glutes weren't your primary movers, meaning that you were feeling your leg muscles doing the majority of the work rather than your glutes doing the majority of the work, you're going to want to keep watching because this video was basically made specifically for you. And don't worry, you aren't alone in this. So many of us have trouble using our glutes in our day-to-day life, like sitting up from a chair or doing stairs or going hiking, because our lifestyle just involves so much sitting around. Say we sit all day at work, working a desk job, or when we get home from work, we're on the couch with our feet up, sitting around and watching Netflix. So when our lifestyle involves so much sitting around, our body tends to adapt. In the case of sitting too much, that's with our hip flexors shortening, and then our core muscles also getting weaker. I'm not saying that sitting is inherently bad. What I'm saying is that us as physiotherapists, we tend to say that your next posture is your best posture. When we're predisposed to having shortened hip flexors, we're gonna have more difficulty using our glute muscles in our day-to-day life. If you do have a sitting job, don't worry, but maybe look into investing in a standing desk. So then instead of sitting for 8 hours a day, all day, then you can take breaks, walk around, or you can stand up from your sitting position, so then we can take breaks every 20 to 30 minutes. But now we're gonna go back to our glute activation exercises. So if you didn't pass that glute bridge test earlier and you were using your leg muscles more than using your glute muscles, this is going to be your 4-step guide to waking up your glutes for good. So the first thing I'd like you to do is a hip flexor stretch. So like we mentioned earlier, your glutes could be difficult to activate because of the position of your pelvis. And it could also be because of our lifestyle habits of liking to sit around too much. Because with prolonged sitting, our hip flexors, like we mentioned earlier, would shorten over time. So I like to use this exercise to lengthen your hip flexors first, so then we have room to go into hip extension. So for a hip flexor stretch, we're going to kneel on one knee. You're gonna tuck in your pelvis into a slight posterior pelvic tilt, and then you're just going to move your body forward. In that position, we're gonna hold it for about 30 seconds, and I like to prescribe 2 sets of that, and you're gonna do both sides. So the most common mistake that I tend to see people do is arching your back when you're moving yourself into this position. So make sure you don't make this mistake by just doing that slight posterior pelvic tilt and then moving your torso forward. So again, we don't want to arch our back when we're doing this, but instead we want to have that slight posterior pelvic tilt and then shift forward. So now for our second exercise in our 4-step guide to activating our glutes is the Supine Glute Squeeze. This is also our first strength exercise. This exercise helps us to actively isolate our glute muscles by us actively contracting them. It is more common than not that if we failed our glute bridge test earlier, that our legs are more dominant than our glute muscles. And because of this, our legs also like to dominate in any kind of glute exercises. So if you have trouble with this exercise, I really want you to practice, because with time, this is going to get easier, but this is one of the easiest foundational exercises you should be able to do before we move on to our next exercises. And this will only get easier as time passes and with your consistency. So for this exercise, all you're going to do is lay flat on a flat surface, and you're going to actively isolate your glutes by squeezing them together. So this is going to require a lot of mind-muscle connection, you thinking, you squeezing your glutes together and not using other leg muscles. I like to prescribe 2 sets of 8 repetitions with an 8-second hold to start. If you'd like to play around and squeeze for longer or shorter or doing less reps or more reps, feel free to do so. But the key thing of this exercise is going to be you actively thinking and isolating the contraction of your gluteus maximus muscles only and trying your best not to use other muscles in your body. If this exercise is too easy, we're going to move on to our next exercise, which is the torso supported hip extension. The torso supported hip extension is our third exercise in our 4-step guide to activating our glutes. This exercise gets us to actively isolate and contract our glute muscles because we're really biasing the gluteus maximus here by letting it do what it does best, which is hip extension and with slight external rotation. So to do the torso supported hip extension, you're going to have your torso supported on a flat surface, and you're going to lift up your leg with your foot in slight external rotation. And to do this hip extension, you got to make sure you're actively using your glute muscles to lift up that leg. So you're going to hold that leg up for 5 seconds, and then slow and controlled, we're going to bring that leg back to this original position. And as you're doing each repetition, make sure you are using that mind-muscle connection again and using your glutes intentionally to bring that leg into hip extension. Because as a physiotherapist, I see it too many times that clients come to me saying that they do all the glute exercises in the world, but when I actively test them, they're actually very, very weak in these movements because, again, the intention isn't there. So make sure when we're doing these exercises, following our 4-step guide, that you are doing every exercise with good intention. So a good set and rep range that I like to prescribe to start is 3 sets of 12. A very common mistake that I see people do all the time is arching your lower back when you're extending that hip. So you want to make sure that your torso is supported. So all we're doing is moving that leg into hip extension and not arching our back. If you do feel like you're arching your back at that end range, you might be going a little bit too high than I would like you to. All I want you to do is go through that hip extension. Once you're there, squeeze your glutes at the top, and then slow and controlled, you're gonna come back down. Also, if your hip flexors are really tight, like we mentioned earlier, you might not have a lot of hip extension, and that's why you might want to arch your back to do this movement. If that is the case, go back to that first stretch that we did earlier and really do that all the time so you get your hip flexor to be in a more lengthened state so we can do this exercise better. Another very common mistake that I see people do is using your hamstrings a little bit too much when you're extending that hip into hip extension. So sometimes I see people bending their knee a little bit too much when they're trying to extend their hip. And if that's the case, you might be recruiting your hamstrings to bring your leg into that hip extension. And if you are somebody who is more hamstring or quad dominant, this is going to be something that you want to watch out for. So now we're going to go on to our 4th exercise, which is the butterfly glute bridge. Earlier when we did our glute bridge test, if you were unable to use your glutes to do the glute bridge, now this exercise is going to be that regression down, where we're going to put our hips into external rotation. So we're taking away using our quads and hamstrings that are dominating to do that hip extension movement. If you do have a history of spraining your ankles all the time, you might want to do this exercise with some caution, but otherwise this exercise should be perfectly fine for your hips, knees, and ankles. So to do this exercise, we're going to lay on our back with our hips into external rotation with knees bent and ankles on the ground. So we're going to do a slight posterior pelvic tilt so our back is flat on the bed, and you're going to engage your core. Using your glutes, we're going to drive our hips up and squeeze at the top. And when on the way down, we're going to be slow and controlled. A very common mistake that I see people make is arching their lower back when they're trying to extend their hip to come up. So to avoid this, just make sure you're doing that slight posterior pelvic tilt that we talked about, and you're going to keep that tilt the whole time to come up. And you're going to keep that tilt the whole time when you're coming down. By doing the slight posterior pelvic tilt, we are driving up with our hips, meaning we're going into that hip extension and not lumbar extension. So that was our 4-step guide to waking up our glutes. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. If you do have friends and family members who have told you in the past that they have trouble using their glutes with activities, feel free to send this video to them so then they can follow this step-by-step guide to waking up their glutes so then they can fix this problem for good. So once you have mastered these exercises is when we can move on to more functional exercises like squats and deadlifts, because ultimately our goal is to be able to use our glutes in our day-to-day life, like when we want to go for a hike, when we want to get up from a chair, when we want to walk upstairs, when we want to do a squat and deadlift, etc., etc. Our glutes are very, very important because they're part of our core, and when we don't have a strong foundation, as in our core and glutes, then we're going to be overusing other muscles in our body, and that can lead to overuse injuries. If you want videos of our next progressions, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you want more video content from me in the future. Also, comment down below what is your favorite glute exercise. Bye for now. now, and thanks for watching. I'll see you in my next video.